May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God. Amen. So this morning's gospel reading is thick. It's got a lot going on, and it's basically split into two separate stories. And at first glance, they don't seem to have anything to do with one another. And so first, we hear about Jesus returning to his hometown after he's become a famous teacher and prophet and healer. And so he goes to the temple to teach, as has become his custom in other places. And the people become suspicious of him once they figure out that he is one of them. It's kind of ironic, right? That's when people are like, "Who is this guy? We know you. Why are you preaching to us?" These are the people that watched him grow up. They have seen his unspecial beginnings as the son of a carpenter. They know his roots. They know where he comes from. And they don't appreciate being preached to by this man that they know as a nobody. You hear them refer to him as the son of Mary. And in this context, without referencing his father also, this is a really major insult. They are putting him in his place. And so he's clearly being perceived as uppity. He's beyond his station. And his home community is offended by him, and he is shocked at their unbelief. And then the second part of this gospel reading is like a totally different story. And that's focused on the disciples instead. And Jesus is instructing them to go out to preach, to teach, to heal. And his commissioning for them is startling. He says, don't bring anything extra with you. No money, no extra clothes, no food, no stuff. All that is necessary is yourself. And he tells them to go out with the hope that they will be cared for by other people, but not with the expectation that they will be. And so they're meant to receive hospitality that is freely given, but when it isn't, they're meant to slowly back out of the doorway, leaving even the dust on the ground just as they found it, and move on to the next place without complaint. And so the connection between these two seemingly very disparate texts is about the identity and the experience of being a follower of Jesus. St. Mark is using these stories to make a point for his audience about how followers of Jesus can be expected to be perceived and treated by other people. Mark wants us, his readers, to have a sense of the very complicated and difficult experiences that will inevitably arise from being a part of what we call the Jesus movement. And so at their core, both parts of this text are about the reality of rejection in Christian life. And when we think about what it means to be a Christian in this time and in this space, rejection is probably not the first word that comes to mind. Especially when we're gathered here on a beautiful day like this, with these wonderful babies, Sarah, Ava, and Sadie. And we gather in this space to baptize them into this incredibly beloved community. It's hard to imagine how rejection could even be a part of this story. And I'm sure many of us experience some degree of resistance or misunderstanding from others about who we are as Christians, what we believe, what grounds we have for believing what we do. And I will admit that even as a priest, I have moments especially with strangers, when I feel apologetic about my own faith. And there are so many ways that I soften my own Christian identity so that it might be more palatable to other people. And there are so many times when it would be so much easier to tell people that I'm just the vice president of a really good nonprofit organization. Unfortunately, that is not my situation. And this is because, as Christians, we are called to care. And caring about anything, as much as we are called to care about everything, is embarrassing. It's embarrassing, especially in a culture that doesn't really value the kind of openness, vulnerability, and unconditional love for neighbors and for strangers that we are very explicitly called to live out. Caring that much about anything is embarrassing. And the painfully honest and passionate love of God that we believe in, that we choose to participate in, most certainly opens us up to the reality of rejection. Now, this idea of rejection actually forms a huge part of Christian identity in the early church. It was a huge part of our story and how we developed as a community and what we felt like we were up against. And Mark is writing to a community who's probably experiencing it in much more intense ways than we do now. But that expectation, that rejection from society and rejection from family is just a part of our lived experience as Christians. That expectation has changed through time and through culture and through dogma. And so it's been argued that these most fundamental parts of Christianity, of our identity of who we are, were actually lost once it became the official state-sanctioned religion of the Roman Empire, and that was in the year 380. And some people still maintain that argument that Christian identity is warped by its ongoing, very complicated relationship with empire, with power. And we think about the ways in which it's become actually very comfortable to be a Christian. And so many of us, especially those of us in the Western world, and especially those of us in the United States, we have had the luxury of being able to practice our faith with a considerable amount of comfort. But in those early days of our tradition, when Mark was writing this account of Jesus, he wrote with the understanding that following Christ inherently meant rejection. It meant persecution and danger. It meant, in so many cases, becoming alien to your own family. It meant being vulnerable and dependent on the generosity of other people. And it meant that at best, you would be teased or scorned, like we see Jesus today. And at the worst, you would be killed, like we see Jesus a little bit farther along in the story. And so Mark is here today to remind us of our very humble roots. And so today's gospel is written to help us understand that we are still, even though we are not experiencing persecution the way that our early brothers and sisters did, we are still wrapped up in a mission that at some level is grounded in rejection. And it is baptism that we celebrate today that ushers all of us into this new kind of life, into this kind of life that is wrapped up in this sacred extended family in which we are all seeking to bring about the reign of God here in our lives, in our time. And Jesus understands that following his path does mean scandal. It means rejection, especially from those who know and love us the most. And Jesus also knows at a very deep level that it is the fear of rejection that holds us back. It's what keeps us from living into all that God desires for us. And so whether that rejection for us comes in the forms of powers and principalities, or whether rejection comes in the form of our most intimate beloveds and communities, and for many of us, rejection comes in the form of our own internal places of judgment and darkness. And so while, again, we may not be persecuted, that fear of rejection is still very alive within us, just as humans. That fear of not being good enough. That fear of potentially being cast out or cast aside is so real and so potent for all of us still. And it infuses not only our actions, but our very being. And so all of us have had enough experience with rejection at one time in our lives that this gospel can ring true to us. That fear, we can feel it. And for a lot of us, I'd imagine it was at a lunch table in junior high, right? Or maybe a really good date who never called you back. And as I was writing this sermon and thinking about all of the ways that I've experienced rejection, I was thinking of, and maybe this is just a product of my generation, but how often we associate rejection with adolescence and things that happen to us in our youth. And so I think of movies like Mean Girls, right? And I think of all of these cultural references about bullying and how hard it is to be a young person. And it kind of bums me out because I feel like that understanding of what rejection is somehow is trying to diminish how painful those experiences are. Because most of us never fully move beyond those experiences in our young life. And that makes rejection in its adult forms even more triggering and terrifying. It's important to acknowledge how much those early experiences damage us. And then as adults, we experience rejection in lost opportunities, in broken relationships, in the loneliness of being unheard or misunderstood. For so many people, rejection comes in the form of how they're perceived after they come out of the closet. For so many of us, there is the institutional rejection of showing up at our borders when they're seeking refuge from violence and from poverty. And so God knows all of this. God has experienced all of this through Jesus. Because Jesus experienced the ultimate form of rejection, and that is the betrayal of his most beloved friends, and then public execution at the hands of fearful and corrupt leadership. So we know that we don't walk alone in this experience. Because Jesus enters into human history, he comes into our story to assure us that with our own baptism, each of us is reborn into a new kind of life where rejection completely loses its meaning. With water and chrism and community, we are all ushered into a way of life where what others think of us has no power over us. And we are called forward today and every day to care, and to care deeply. We are called forward to spread Christ's message of goodness and mercy into our communities and the world around us. And I invite you, as we move into the baptisms in a few minutes, always to really read the words of our baptismal covenant. It is one of the most beautiful, important, sacred parts of being an Episcopalian. And when you read them, let us all be reminded that if we do truly commit to preaching the love of God through word and through action in the way that the covenant demands, we will absolutely open ourselves up to all kinds of criticism and unbelief. We will expose ourselves. We will make ourselves very vulnerable, especially to those in power, especially to those who are very comfortable, and to those who fear change. And yes, our feelings will get hurt. For some of us, our bodies will get hurt, and it will be embarrassing. Being a Christian is embarrassing. It has been since the beginning. But we know that there is nothing on earth that can shake our status as beloved children of God. And so think about how that frees you up. Think of how that liberates you. If rejection is expected, and if vulnerability and open-heartedness is the norm, think of how differently we can move in the world. Just like our disciple ancestors, we are invited to shed our extra clothes and bread and money and stuff. We are invited to leave behind that baggage of self-consciousness, of self-protection, and of fear. And we are freed up to carry God instead. We are freed up not only to carry God's generosity and mercy out into the world, but we are freed up to receive it from others as well. So yes, babies, following Jesus is painful. It's embarrassing. You're going to cry a little bit. Because it's scary to care the way that we do. It's scary to be open to the love of God the way that we are. But baptism is our invitation to loosen our grip on what other people think. God knows us and loves us more than anyone ever could. And so today we welcome these three wonderful souls into this great family of risk and rejection and great reward. It won't be easy or comfortable, but it will open all of us up to exquisite, life-changing beauty and grace. God is here, so welcome. Amen.